Hey everybody, it's Nate with Zbroz, and today we're going to go over how to install our Honda Pioneer 2-inch lift bracket kit. On those applications like the XP1000,
we supply a divider that's cut down.
billet nut. Another Honda Talon. This happens to be a 1000R. Okay, aside from whatever you need to get your tires and wheels off, you're going to need these basic hand tools. Pair of needle nose pliers, a straight screwdriver or a dart puller, either will work. Phillips screwdriver, 17mm end wrench, 19mm end wrench, ratchet with a short extension, and then the 17 and 19mm sockets. That is all the hand tools that you'll need to install this kit. We have our vehicle on a lift, but this can be done with a floor jack. But you do want to get your wheel and tire out of the way and pull the shocks off and just get those out of the way. It'll just make it a little bit easier. You can feed the brackets in without removing the shock completely, but for this video, so you can see things a little bit better, we're going to get the shock all the way out of the way. So 17mm wrench, you can remove the upper and lower shock mounts. One thing to note, this is the machine that has the Fox QS3 shocks. And there is little spacers on these shocks. Just pay attention to whatever shock you have and make sure you keep the bolt and spacers in the correct position. So pull these off and get these out of the way first, and then we'll show you step one for the front. All right, and remove both your right and your left shocks to get those out of your way. In order to get this front bracket, it goes all the way across the front of the car, you'll see, so getting both sides out of the way will help a lot. Remove the plastic shroud, fan shroud deflector. There's 3 different buttons that will have to be pushed out using a pry bar or something, and get that out of the way so that the bracket can go on the front of the metal piece right here, and then one will go on the back. All right, to give yourself easier access to that plastic fan shroud director, remove this intake boot here. Just a Phillips screwdriver or 6mm, and get that out of your way, and then you can see that deflector, and there's 3 little pins that we've got to remove with a straight screwdriver to get the shroud deflector to basically move out of the way. All right, so this is that plastic shroud. The hardest part is getting these darts out so that you can pull that off and get it out of the way. These darts are, sometimes they're hard. They sell little tools that will pull these out. If you damage them, they're pretty easy to find at any local hardware store. So we're going to locate the correct spacer, and this spacer is roughly 1.25 inches wide or 32mm wide. So it's kind of the medium length, but if you just measure that, it's 1.25 inches. The way you know is it'll actually fit up inside the factory shock mount. And then you're going to locate a bolt and a nut, and there's a couple of different length bolts. There's some really long ones, there's kind of a medium length and then a short. We're going to grab the medium length bolt and nut, and that's what's going to go here to hold the bracket in place on both sides. And then these front brackets, and this is what's going to slide all the way from side to side. It's going to be kind of hard to see, but you can see there's a cutout here, and that fits around the tube, so that sits up in. And then you can grab one of your bolts and your spacer. The spacer is going to slide up between the factory mount, and then that bolt will go in the stock shock location. So slide that across where it's not coming out, and do the same thing on the other side. And then we're going to put the front mount across like so. So you're going to slide it across the same way, and then you can slide your bolt all the way through. And and put a nut on just loosely, and then do the same thing to the other side. All right, so now that we have both of the bolts in, you can go ahead and snug these up. You don't want to over tighten them now. We'll tighten everything at the end. And this is, once you get these snug, you can put your shroud back in. We have cutouts in our brace so that you can get those little bullets, plastic bullets. You can put the shroud back in, and don't forget to put your little boot back on. So that's your decision if you want to run that extra shroud and put it back in. But again, just make sure you get this stuff snug before you put it in and then put your boot on, or it's your choice if you want to leave that off. So, all right, so now to put your shock on, you're going to locate the shortest of the 3 bolt lengths and also the shortest of the spacer. It's about 6.5 millimeters, or roughly 1/4 of an inch. But as far as the spacers go, it's the shortest one and the shortest bolt. And the spacer is just going to go between the shock and the bracket. So you'll have to fish that little 1/4 inch spacer up in, and then slide your bolt across and through, and then put your nut on. Lower shock mount is unchanged, so you can just use your factory hardware there. And it's going to be 17 millimeter on the factory hardware, and then 19 millimeter on the supplied hardware. So tighten those up. Those so 6, you're going to have 3 per side. Factory lower, the new upper, and then the mount bolt. Get those tight, and you're good to go on the front. Moving to the rear of the car, this is going to be the same basic process. We want to get our shock out of the way. So 17 millimeter wrenches to remove the shock mount bolts, top and bottom, and move the shock. And you're going to want to remove both sides, because we're going to want the suspension to droop all the way out so that we have space to work. Okay, so we have the rear shocks removed on both sides and out of our way. We're going to locate 2 of these brackets, rear brackets, and you're going to need 2 of the smallest spacers. Measurement on these is 1/4 inch, the super thin ones, and 2 of the long bolts, which are left, and 2 nuts. So I'm going to grab spacer. It's kind of self-explanatory the way that these go on. It's kind of going to be hard to see, but it's going to slide up over like this, and then your bolt, you can start there, and the other one obviously just slides in from the front. You kind of have to finagle it around. So it's going to set against here, but these small spacers back up behind the existing shock bolt location. That's where the small spacers go. So I've just got one of these bolts in there as a placeholder. So we're gonna grab another bolt and one of the small spacers, and that small spacer kind of falls in a little hole that the factory mount. So hard to see, but we're going to start the bolt through there. My placeholder didn't stay. And then you've got two more of these shorter spacers like we used on the front. I believe they're 1.25 inches or 32 millimeters roughly, correct? That's going to go up into your stock shock mount location. We have that spacer behind there, and we're going to need another thin spacer on the other side. These factory brackets kind of have a little bend in them. It's kind of hard to see, but that's what those spacers are taking up. So then feed the other short spacer. And just stick it on the end of this bolt. It's always harder to do everything on camera, trying to show somebody than to just do it. So now we have that in. That's gonna hold the bracket basically where it's gonna go. Now you're gonna have more bolts and spacers. So the next longest spacer, I'll give you a measurement on this, 1.8 or 50 millimeters wide. Excuse me, 46 millimeters wide or 1.8. That's gonna be this bottom one. And the spacers, they pretty much make sense because that's the only way that they're gonna go in. They won't fit anywhere else. And then all these bolts are the same length in the rear. Thread that one in. And then the longest spacer here is 2.1. 2.135 or 50, just over 54 millimeters with a long bolt. That's going here. And then when it's all sandwiched together, and I would say tighten these up to snug with your 19 millimeter. And then do the same thing on the other side. And then we're gonna utilize a thin spacer with the final upper shock bolt. So we'll show you that. So I'm just gonna go through and tighten all these up quick so that they're snug. And then we'll do the other side to this point, and then we'll put the shock back in. All right, so we have the bracket tight and all those, the new provided bolts all snug. I'm gonna use the factory lower bolt, drop that in, and then as you can see, that's why you wanna have both of them unhooked, because you're gonna have to kind of pull down to line this up. And then using a new supplied bolt and the two, what I'm gonna say is the second to shortest spacers. They're 10 millimeters wide, which is, you know, about 0.4395. So it's the second to the thinnest, which should just make sense because as you try to put your new bolt in, you're gonna have a huge gap between the shock. So awesome pull down on that side. A little bit more right there. So you're gonna feed that through with a spacer. Then you've gotta feed this other spacer up in there without dropping it, like I did. And then feed the bolt all the way across like that. And then using supplied nut, now torque all of these bolts to the factory torque spec with a 19 millimeter. So we're gonna go ahead and tighten this up, and that'll close that little bit of gap that you have, and then just go through and double check all the other ones and make sure they're tight, and duplicate it on the other side, and you're done. Okay, so one thing to note on the passenger side rear, there's a sensor line that runs down to the rear diff. There's a little bracket in the middle that you're gonna need to remove. And I would say, you know, zip tie, because it can't really get to the exhaust, but they're obviously using that pin location to hold it from flopping around. But to get that back plate on, you're gonna need to remove that. And then the plate will go in just like on the other side, like so. And then I would say utilize a zip tie to hold this out of the way, or you can just remove that clip altogether. But that is one thing to note on this particular model that we have showing here, that you'll need to remove that to get that back bracket on. The front bracket, there's nothing in the way, but it's just that rear passenger side bracket. All right, thanks for following along on how to install this lift kit. As you can see, we do have 2 inches of lift out of the bracket lift. It's pretty easy to install, and it's available at your local Zbroz dealer or as always, you can order it directly from zbrozracing.com, and we'll see you out there on the trails.